Chapter 20 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 20. Loved and Lost. Philip walked towards the Robsons' farm like a man in a dream, who has everything around him according to his wish, and yet is conscious of a secret, mysterious, inevitable drawback to his enjoyment. Hepburn did not care to think, would not realize what this drawback, which need not have been mysterious in his case, was. The May evening was glorious in light and shadow. The crimson sun warmed up the chilly northern air to a semblance of pleasant heat. The spring sights and sounds were all about. The lambs were bleating out their gentle weariness before they sank to rest by the side of their mothers. The linnets were chirping in every bush of golden gorse that grew out of the stone walls. The lark was singing her good night in the cloudless sky, before she dropped down to her nest in the tender green wheat. All spoke of brooding peace, but Philip's heart was not at peace. Yet he was going to proclaim his good fortune. His masters had that day publicly announced that Coulson and he were to be their successors, and he had now arrived at that longed-for point in his business when he had resolved to openly speak of his love to Sylvia, and might openly strive to gain her love. But alas, the fulfilment of that wish of his had lagged sadly behind. He was placed as far as he could, even in his most sanguine moments, have hoped to be as regarded business, but Sylvia was as far from his attainment as ever, nay, farther. Still, the great obstacle was removed in Kinraid's impressment. Philip took upon himself to decide that, with such a man as the specksioneer, absence was equivalent to faithless forgetfulness. He thought that he had just grounds for this decision in the account he had heard of Kinraid's behaviour to Annie Coulson, to the other nameless young girl, her successor in his fickle heart, in the ribald talk of the sailors in the Newcastle public house. It would be well for Sylvia if she could forget as quickly, and, to promote this oblivion, the name of her lover should never be brought up, either in praise or blame. And Philip would be patient and enduring, all the time watching over her, and labouring to win her reluctant love. There she was. He saw her as he stood at the top of the little hill path leading down to the Robsons' door. She was out of doors, in the garden, which at some distance from the house sloped up the bank on the opposite side of the gully, much too far off to be spoken to, not too far off to be gazed at by eyes that caressed her every movement. How well Philip knew that garden, placed long ago by some tenant of the farm on a southern slope, walled in with rough moorland stones, planted with berry bushes for use, and southernwood and sweetbriar for sweetness of smell. When the Robsons had first come to Haytersbank, and Sylvia was scarcely more than a pretty child, how well he remembered helping her with the arrangement of this garden, laying out his few spare pence in hen and chicken daisies at one time, in flower seeds at another, again in a rose tree in a pot. He knew how his unaccustomed hands had laboured with the spade at forming a little primitive bridge over the beck in the hollow before winter streams should make it too deep for fording, how he had cut down branches of the mountain ash and covered them over, yet decked with their scarlet berries, with sods of green turf, beyond which the brilliancy crept out. But now it was months and years since he had been in that garden, which had lost its charm for Sylvia, as she found the bleak sea winds came up and blighted all endeavours at cultivating more than the most useful things, pot herbs, marigolds, potatoes, onions, and such like. Why did she tarry there now, standing quite motionless up by the highest bit of wall, looking over the sea, with her hand shading her eyes? Quite motionless, as if she were a stone statue. He began to wish she would move, would look at him, but any way that she would move, and not stand gazing thus over that great dreary sea. He went down the path with an impatient step, and entered the house-place. There sat his aunt spinning, and apparently as well as ever. He could hear his uncle talking to Kester in the neighbouring shippen. All was well in the household. Why was Sylvia standing in the garden in that strange quiet way? "Why, lad, thou'rt a sight for saireen," said his aunt, as she stood up to welcome him back. "And when didst ta come, eh? But thy uncle'll be glad to see thee, and to hear thee talk about yon pleughs. He's thought a great deal o' thy letters. I'll go call him in." "Not yet," said Philip, stopping her in her progress towards the door. He's busy talking to Kester. I'm in no haste to be gone. I can stay a couple of hours. Sit down and tell me how you are yoursel, and how everything is. I've a deal to tell you." "To be sure, to be sure. To think thou's been in Lunnon since I saw thee. Well, to be sure. There's a vast a comin' and goin' i' this world. Thou'll mind yon specksioneer lad, him as was cousin to the Corneys, Charlie Kinraid?" "Mind him? As if he could forget him." "Well, he's dead and gone." "Dead? Who told you? I don't understand," said Philip in strange bewilderment. Could Kinraid have tried to escape after all, and been wounded, killed in the attempt? If not, how should they know he was dead? Missing he might be, though how this should be known was strange, as he was supposed to be sailing to the Greenland seas. But dead! What did they mean? At Philip's worst moment of hatred he had hardly dared to wish him dead. "Dunnot you mention it afore our Sylvie. We niver speak on him to her, for she takes it a deal to heart, though I'm thinking it were a good thing for her, for he'd a got a hold of her. He had on Bessie Corney too, as her mother telled me. Not that I ever let on to them as Sylvia frets after him, so keep a calm sough, my lad. It's a girl's fancy, just a kind o' calf love. Let it go by. And it's well for her he's dead, though it's hard to say so on a drowned man." "Drowned?" said Philip. "How do you know?" half hoping that the poor drenched swollen body might have been found, and thus all questions and dilemmas solved. Kinraid might have struggled overboard with ropes or handcuffs on, and so have been drowned. "Eh, lad, there's no misdoubting it. He were thought a deal on by t' captain o' t' Urania, and when he niver come back on t' day when he ought to have sailed, he sent to Kinraid's people at Cullercoats, and they sent to Brunton's in Newcastle, and they knew he'd been here. T' captain put off sailing for 2 or 3 days, that he might ha' had that much law, but when he heard as Kinraid were not at Corney's, but had left him almost on to a week, he went off to them northern seas with t' next specksioneer he could find, for there's no use speaking ill on't dead, and though I couldn't bear his coming for ever about the house, he were a rare good specksioneer, as I've been told." "But how do you know he was drowned?" said Philip, feeling guiltily disappointed at his aunt's story. "Why, lad, I'm almost ashamed to tell thee. I were sore put out mysel, but Sylvia were so broken hearted like I couldn't cast it up to her as I couldn't have liked. The silly lass had gone and given him a bit of ribbon, as many a one knowed, for it had been a vast noticed and admired that even at the Corneys, New Year's Eve I think it were, and t' poor vain peacock had tied it on his hat, so that when t' tide hist, there's Sylvie coming in at the back door. Never let on." And in a forced, made-up voice she inquired aloud, for hitherto she had been speaking almost in a whisper, "And didst to see King George and Queen Charlotte?" Philip could not answer, did not hear. His soul had gone out to meet Sylvia, who entered with quiet slowness quite unlike her former self. Her face was wan and white, her grey eyes seemed larger and full of dumb, tearless sorrow. She came up to Philip as if his being there had touched her with no surprise, and gave him a gentle greeting as if he were a familiar, indifferent person whom she had seen but yesterday. Philip, who had recollected the quarrel they had had, and about Kinraid too, the very last time they had met, had expected some trace of this remembrance to linger in her looks and speech to him. But there was no such sign. Her great sorrow had wiped away all anger, almost all memory. Her mother looked at her anxiously, and then said in the same manner of forced cheerfulness which she had used before, "Here's Philip, lass, a full o' Lunnon. Call thy father in, and we'll hear about the new fangled pleughs. It'll be rare and nice sitting together again." Sylvia, silent and docile, went out to the shippen to obey her mother's wish. Bell Robson leant forwards towards Philip, misinterpreting the expression on his face, which was guilt as much as sympathy, and checked the possible repentance which might have urged him on at that moment to tell all he knew, by saying, "Lad, it's a' for the best. He were noane good enough for her, and I misdoubt me he were only playing wi' her as he'd done by others. Let her a be, let her a be. She'll come round to be thankful." Robson bustled in with a loud welcome, all the louder and more talkative because he, like his wife, assumed a cheerful manner before Sylvia. Yet he, unlike his wife, had many a secret regard over Kinraid's fate. At first, while merely the fact of his disappearance was known, Daniel Robson had hit on the truth, and had stuck to his opinion that the cursed press gang were at the bottom of it. He had backed his words by many an oath, and all the more because he had not a single reason to give that applied to the present occasion. No one on the lonely coast had remarked any sign of the presence of the men of war, or the tenders that accompanied them, for the purpose of impressment on the king's ships. At Shields, and at the mouth of the Tyne, where they lay in greedy wait, the owners of the Urania had caused strict search to be made for their skilled and protected specksioneer, but with no success. All this positive evidence in contradiction to Daniel Robson's opinion only made him cling to it the more, until the day when the hat was found on the shore with Kinraid's name written out large and fair in the inside, and the tell-tale bit of ribbon knotted in the band. Then Daniel, by a sudden revulsion, gave up every hope. It never entered his mind that it could have fallen off by accident. No, now Kinraid was dead and drowned, and it was a bad job, and the sooner it could be forgotten the better for all parties. And it was well no one knew how far it had gone with Sylvia, especially now since Bessie Corney was crying her eyes out as if he had been engaged to her. So Daniel said nothing to his wife about the mischief that had gone on in her absence, and never spoke to Sylvia about the affair, only he was more than usually tender to her in his rough way, and thought morning, noon, and night on what he could do to give her pleasure, and drive away every recollection of her ill-starred love. To-night he would have her sit by him while Philip told his stories, or heavily answered questions put to him. Sylvia sat on a stool by her father's knee, holding one of his hands in both of hers, and presently she laid down her head upon them, and Philip saw her sad eyes looking into the flickering firelight with a long unwinking stare, showing that her thoughts were far distant. He could hardly go on with his tales of what he had seen, and what done, he was so full of pity for her. Yet for all his pity, he had now resolved never to soothe her with the knowledge of what he knew, nor to deliver the message sent by her false lover. He felt like a mother withholding something injurious from the foolish wish of her plaining child. But he went away without breathing a word of his good fortune and business. The telling of such kind of good fortune seemed out of place this night, when the thought of death and the loss of friends seemed to brood over the household, and cast its shadow there, obscuring for the time all worldly things. And so the great piece of news came out in the ordinary course of gossip, told by some Monkshaven friend to Robson the next market day. For months Philip had been looking forward to the sensation which the intelligence would produce in the farm household, as a preliminary to laying his good fortune at Sylvia's feet. And they heard of it, and he away, and all chance of his making use of it in the manner he had intended vanished for the present. Daniel was always curious after other people's affairs, and now was more than ever bent on collecting scraps of news which might possibly interest Sylvia, and rouse her out of the state of indifference as to everything into which she had fallen. Perhaps he thought that he had not acted altogether wisely in allowing her to engage herself to Kinraid, for he was a man apt to judge by results, and moreover he had had so much reason to repent of the encouragement which he had given to the lover whose untimely end had so deeply affected his only child, that he was more unwilling than ever that his wife should know of the length to which the affair had gone during her absence. He even urged secrecy upon Sylvia as a personal favour, unwilling to encounter the silent blame which he openly affected to despise. "Will noan fret thy mother by letting on how oft he came and went. She'll maybe be thinking he were for speaking to thee, my poor lass, and it would put her out a deal, for she's a woman of stern mind towards matrimony, and she'll be noan so strong till summer weather comes, and I'd be loath to give her aught to worrit hersel about. So thee and me'll keep our own counsel." "I wish mother had been here, then she'd ha' known all without my telling her." "Cheer up, lass, it's better as it is. Thou'll get o'er it sooner for having no one to let on to. I myself am noan going to speak on't again." No more he did, but there was a strange tenderness in his tones when he spoke to her, a half pathetic way of seeking after her, if by any chance she was absent for a minute from the places where he expected to find her, a consideration for her, about this time, in his way of bringing back trifling presents, or small pieces of news that he thought might interest her, which sank deep into her heart. "And what dun yo think o' the folks is talking on Monkshaven?" said he, almost before he had taken off his coat, on the day when he had heard of Philip's promotion in the world. "Why, missus, thy nephew, Philip Hepburn, has got his name up in gold letters 4 inch long o'er Foster's door. Him and Coulson has set up shop together, and Foster's is gone out." "That's t' secret of his journey to Lunnon," said Bell, more gratified than she chose to show. 4 inch long, if there at all. I heerd on it at the Bay Horse first, but I thought you'd never be satisfied bout I seed it wi' my own eyes. They do say as Gregory Jones, t' plumber, got it done i' York, for that nought else would satisfy old Jeremiah. It'll be a matter o' some hundreds a year o' Philip's pocket." "There'll be fusters in the background, as one may say, to take t' bigger share o' the profits," said Bell.
Ay, ay, but that's as it should be, for I reckon they'll ha' to find the brass the first, my lass, said he, turning to Sylvia. I'm fain to tak thee into town to next market day, just for to see it. I'll buy thee a bonny ribbon for thy hair out of the cousin's own shop.
Some thought of another ribbon which had once tied up her hair, and afterwards been cut in twain, must have crossed Sylvia's mind, for she answered, as if she shrank from her father's words, "I cannot go. I'm noane wanting a ribbon. I'm much obliged, father, all the same." Her mother read her heart clearly, and suffered with her, but never spoke a word of sympathy. But she went on rather more quickly than she would otherwise have done to question her husband as to all he knew about this great rise of Philip's. Once or twice Sylvia joined in with languid curiosity, but presently she became tired and went to bed. For a few moments after she left, her parents sat silent. Then Daniel, in a tone as if he were justifying his daughter, and comforting himself as well as his wife, observed that it was almost on for 9. The evenings were light so long now. Belle said nothing in reply, but gathered up her wool and began to arrange the things for night. By and by Daniel broke the silence by saying, "I thought at one time as Philip had a fancy for our Sylvie." For a minute or two Belle did not speak. Then, with deeper insight into her daughter's heart than her husband, in spite of his greater knowledge of the events that had happened to affect it, she said, "If thou's thinking on a match between 'em, it'll be a long time afore the poor sad wretch is fit to think on another man as sweetheart." "I said nought about sweethearts," replied he, as if his wife had reproached him in some way. "Woman's allays so full o' sweethearts and matrimony. I only said as I thought once as Philip had a fancy for our lass, and I think so still, and he'll be worth his 200 year before long. But I never said nought about sweethearts." End of chapter 20. One of Sylvia's lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 21. A Rejected Suitor. There were many domestic arrangements to be made in connection with the new commercial ones which affected Hepburn and Coulson. The Fosters, with something of the busybodiness which is apt to mingle itself with kindly patronage, had planned in their own minds that the Rose household should be removed altogether to the house belonging to the shop, and that Alice, with the assistance of the capable servant, who at present managed all John's domestic affairs, should continue as mistress of the house, with Philip and Coulson for her lodgers. But arrangements without her consent did not suit Alice at any time, and she had very good reasons for declining to accede to this. She was not going to be uprooted at her time of life, she said, nor would she consent to enter upon a future which might be so uncertain. Why, Hepburn and Coulson were both young men, she said, and they were as likely to marry as not, and then the bride would be sure to wish to live in the good old-fashioned house at the back of the shop. It was in vain she was told by every one concerned that in the case of such an event the first married partner would take a house of his own, leaving her in undisputed possession. She replied with apparent truth that both might wish to marry, and surely the wife of one ought to take possession of the house belonging to the business, that she was not going to trust herself to the fancies of young men, who were always, the best of them, going and doing the very thing that was most foolish in the way of marriage, of which state, in fact, she spoke with something of acrimonious contempt and dislike, as if young people always got mismatched, yet had not the sense to let older and wiser people choose for them. "Thou'll not have been understanding why Alice Rose spoke as she did this morning," said Jeremiah Foster to Philip, on the afternoon succeeding the final discussion of this plan. "She was a thinking of her youth, I reckon, when she was a well-favoured young woman, and our John was full of the thought of marrying her. As he could not have her, he has lived a bachelor all his days, but if I am not a vast mistaken, all that he has will go to her and to Hester, for all that Hester is the child of another man. Thee and Coulson should have a try for Hester, Philip. I have told Coulson this day of Hester's chances. I told him first because he is my wife's nephew, but I tell thee now, Philip, it would be a good thing for the shop if one of ye was married." Philip reddened. Often as the idea of marriage had come into his mind, this was the first time it had been gravely suggested to him by another, but he replied quietly enough, "I don't think Hester Rose has any thought of matrimony." "To be sure not. It is for thee or for William Coulson to make her think. She, maybe, remembers enough of her mother's life with her father to make her slow to think on such things.
But it's in her to think on matrimony. It's in all of us." "Alice's husband was dead before I knew her," said Philip, rather evading the main subject. "It was a mercy when he were taken, a mercy to them who were left, I mean. Alice was a bonny young woman, with a smile for everybody, when he wed her, a smile for every one except our John, who could never do enough to try and win one from her. But no, she would have none of him, but set her heart on Jack Rose, a sailor in a whale ship. And so they were married at last, though all her own folks were against it. And he was a profligate sinner, and went after other women, and drank and beat her. She turned as stiff and as grey as thou seest her now, without a year of Hester's birth. I believe they'd have perished for want and cold many a time if it had not been for John. If she ever guessed where the money came from, it must have hurt her pride above a bit, for she was always a proud woman. But mother's love is stronger than pride." Philip fell to thinking. A generation ago something of the same kind had been going on as that which he was now living through, quick with hopes and fears. A girl beloved by two, nay, those two so identical in occupation as he and Kinraid were, Rose identical even in character with what he knew of this Becksionier, a girl choosing the wrong lover, and suffering and soured all her life in consequence of her youth's mistake. Was that to be Sylvia's lot? Or rather, was she not saved from it by the event of the impressment, and by the course of silence he himself had resolved upon? Then he went on to wonder if the lives of one generation were but a repetition of the lives of those who had gone before, with no variation but from the internal cause that some had greater capacity for suffering than others. Would those very circumstances which make the interest of his life now return in due cycle when he was dead and Sylvia was forgotten? Perplexed thoughts of this and a similar kind kept returning into Philip's mind whenever he had leisure to give himself up to consideration of anything but the immediate throng of business. And every time he dwelt upon this complication and succession of similar events, he emerged from his reverie more and more satisfied with the course he had taken in withholding from Sylvia all knowledge of her lover's fate. It was settled at length that Philip was to remove to the house belonging to the shop, Coulson remaining with Alice and her daughter. But in the course of the summer the latter told his partner that he had offered marriage to Hester on the previous day, and been refused. It was an awkward affair together, as he lived in their house, and was in daily companionship with Hester, who, however, seemed to preserve her gentle calmness, with only a tinge more of reserve in her manner to Coulson. "I wish you could find out what she has again me, Philip," said Coulson, about a fortnight after he had made the proposal. The poor young man thought that Hester's composure of manner towards him since the event argued that he was not distasteful to her, and as he was now on very happy terms with Philip, he came constantly to him, as if the latter could interpret the meaning of all the little occurrences between him and his beloved. "I'm a right age, not 2 months betwixt us, and there's few in Monkshaven as would think on her wi' better prospects than me, and she knows my folks, we're kind o' cousins in fact, and I'd be like a son to her mother, and there's noan in Monkshaven as can speak again my character. There's nought between you and her, is there, Philip? I had telled thee many a time that she and me is like brother and sister. She's no more thought on me than I have for her. So be content with, for I's not tell thee again. Don't be vexed, Philip. If thou knew what it was to be in love, thou'd be always fancying things just as I am." "I might be," said Philip, "but I dunnot think I should always be talking about my fancies." "I wunnot talk any more after this once, if thou'll just find out for thysel, as it were, what it is she has again me. I'd go to chapel for ever with her, if that's what she wants. Just ask her, Philip." "It's an awkward thing for me to be melling with," said Hepburn reluctantly. "But thou said thee and she were like brother and sister, and a brother would ask a sister and never think twice about it." "Well, well," replied Philip, "I'll see what I can do. But, lad, I dunnot think she'll have thee. She doesn't fancy thee, and fancy is 3 parts o' love, if reason is t'other fourth." But somehow Philip could not begin on the subject with Hester. He did not know why, except that, as he said, it was so awkward. But he really liked Coulson so much as to be anxious to do what the latter wished, although he was almost convinced that it would be of no use. So he watched his opportunity, and found Alice alone and at leisure one Sunday evening. She was sitting by the window reading her Bible when he went in. She gave him a curt welcome, heartily enough for her, for she was always chary in her expressions of pleasure or satisfaction. But as she took off her horn spectacles and placed them in the book to keep her place, and then turning more fully round on her chair so as to face him, she said, "Well, lad, and how does it go on? Though it's not a day for to ask about worldly things, but I niver see thee now but on Sabbath day, and rarely then. Still we munnot speak o' such things on t' Lord's day. So thee mun just say how t' shop is doing, and then we'll leave such vain talk. T' shop is doing main and well, thank ye, mother, but Coulson could tell you that any day. I'd a deal rayther hear fra thee, Philip. Coulson doesn't know how to manage his own business, let alone half the business as it took John and Jeremiah's heads, ay, and tasked 'em too, to manage. I've no patience with Coulson. Why? He's a decent young fellow as ever there is in Monkshaven. He may be. He's noan cut his wisdom teeth yet. But for that matter, there's other folks as far fra sense as he is. Ay, and farther. Coulson mayn't be so bright at all times as he might be, but he's a steady goer, and I'd back him up again any chap of his age in Monkshaven. I know who I'd sooner back in many a thing, Philip. She said it with so much meaning that he could not fail to understand that he himself was meant, and he replied ingenuously enough, If you mean me, mother, I'll noan deny that in a thing or two I may be more knowledgeable than Coulson. I've had a deal of time on my hands in my youth, and I'd good schooling as long as father lived. Lad, it's not schooling, nor knowledge, nor book learning as carries a man through t' world. It's mother wit, and it's noan schooling, nor knowledge, nor book learning as takes a young woman. It's summat as cannot be put into words. That's just what I told Coulson, said Philip quickly. He were sore put about because Hester had given him the bucket, and came to me about it. And what did thou say? asked Alice, her deep eyes gleaming at him as if to read his face as well as his words. Philip, thinking he could now do what Coulson had begged of him in the neatest manner, went on. I told him I'd help him all as I could. Thou did thou? Well, well, there's not so queer as folks, that I will say, muttered Alice between her teeth. But that fancy had 3 parts to do with love, continued Philip, and it would be hard, maybe, to get a reason for her not fancying him. Yet I wish she'd think twice about it. He's so set upon having her. I think he'll do himself a mischief with fretting if it goes on as it is. It'll noan go on as it is, said Alice with gloomy oracularness. How not? asked Philip. Then, receiving no answer, he went on. He loves her true, and he's within a month or 2 on her age, and his character will bear handling on all sides, and his share on shop will be worth hundreds a year before long. Another pause. Alice was trying to bring down her pride to say something, which she could not with all her efforts. Maybe you'll speak a word for him, mother, said Philip, annoyed at her silence. I'll do no such thing. Marriages are best made without melling. How do I know but what she likes someone better? Our Hester's not the last to think on a young man unless he's been a wooing on her. And you know mother as well as I do, and Coulson does too. She's never given any one a chance to woo her, living half her time here and t'other half in shop, and never speaking to no one by t' way. I wish thou wouldn't come here a-troubling me on a Sabbath day with thy vanity and thy worldly talk. I'd liefer by far be o' that world where there's neither marrying nor giving in marriage, for it's all a moithering mess here. She turned to the closed Bible lying on the dresser, and opened it with a bang. While she was adjusting her spectacles on her nose, with hands trembling with passion, she heard Philip say, I ask your pardon, I'm sure. I couldn't well come any other day. It's all the same. I care not. But thou might as well tell truth. I'll be bound thou's been at Haytersbank Farm some day this week. Philip reddened. In fact, he had forgotten how he had got to consider his frequent visits to the farm as a regular piece of occupation. He kept silence. Alice looked at him with a sharp intelligence that read his silence through. I thought so. Next time thou thinks to thyself, I'm more knowledgeable than Coulson, just remember Alice Rose's words, and they are these. If Coulson's too thick-sighted to see through a board, thou'rt too blind to see through a window. As for coming and speaking up for Coulson, why, he'll be married to some one else afore 't year's out, for all he thinks he's so set upon Hester now. Go thy ways, and leave me to my scripture, and come no more on Sabbath days with thy vain babbling. So Philip returned from his mission rather crestfallen, but quite as far as ever from seeing through a glass window. Before the year was out, Alice's prophecy was fulfilled. Coulson, who found the position of a rejected lover in the same house with the girl who had refused him too uncomfortable to be endured, as soon as he was convinced that his object was decidedly out of his reach, turned his attention to some one else. He did not love his new sweetheart as he had done Hester. There was more of reason and less of fancy in his attachment. But it ended successfully, and before the first snow fell,
Philip was best man at his partner's wedding. End of chapter 21.
22 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 22. Deepening Shadows. But before Coulson was married, many small events happened. Small events to all but Philip. To him they were as the sun and moon. The days when he went up to Haytersbank and Sylvia spoke to him. The days when he went up and she had apparently no heart to speak to any one, but left the room as soon as he came, or never entered it at all, although she must have known that he was there. These were his alternations from happiness to sorrow. From her parents he always had a welcome. Oppressed by their daughter's depression of spirits, they hailed the coming of any visitor as a change for her as well as for themselves. The former intimacy with the Corneys was in abeyance for all parties, owing to Bessie Corney's outspoken grief for the loss of her cousin, as if she had had reason to look upon him as her lover, whereas Sylvia's parents felt this as a slur upon their daughter's cause of grief. But although at this time the members of the two families ceased to seek after each other's society, nothing was said. The thread of friendship might be joined afresh at any time, only just now it was broken, and Philip was glad of it. Before going to Haytersbank he sought each time for some little present with which to make his coming welcome. And now he wished even more than ever that Sylvia had cared for learning. If she had, he could have taken her many a pretty ballad or story-book, such as were then in vogue. He did try her with a translation of The Sorrows of Werther, so popular at the time that it had a place in all pedlars' baskets, with Law's Serious Call, The Pilgrim's Progress, Klopstock's Messiah, and Paradise Lost, but she could not read it for herself. And after turning the leaves languidly over, and smiling a little at the picture of Charlotte cutting bread and butter in a left-handed manner, she put it aside on the shelf by the Complete Farrier, and there Philip saw it, upside down and untouched, the next time he came to the farm. Many a time during that summer did he turn to the few verses in Genesis in which Jacob's twice 7 years' service for Rachel is related, and try and take fresh heart from the reward which came to the patriarch's constancy at last. After trying books, nosegays, small presents of pretty articles of dress, such as suited the notions of those days, and finding them all received with the same languid gratitude, he set himself to endeavour to please her in some other way. It was time that he should change his tactics, for the girl was becoming weary of the necessity for thanking him, every time he came, for some little favour or other. She wished he would let her alone, and not watch her continually with such sad eyes. Her father and mother hailed her first signs of impatient petulance towards him as a return to the old state of things before Kinraid had come to disturb the tenor of their lives, for even Daniel had turned against the specksioneer, irritated by the Corneys' loud moans over the loss of the man to whom their daughter said that she was attached. If Daniel wished for him to be alive again, it was mainly that the Corneys might be convinced that his last visit to the neighbourhood of Monkshaven was for the sake of the pale and silent Sylvia, and not for that of Bessie, who complained of Kinraid's untimely death rather as if by it she had been cheated of a husband, than for any overwhelming personal love towards the deceased. If he were after her, he were a big black scoundrel, that's what he were, and I wish he were alive again to be hung. But I dunna believe it. Them Corney lasses were allays talking and a-thinking on sweethearts, and niver a man crossed threshold but they tried on as a husband. And their mother were no better. Kinraid had spoken civil to Bessie as became a lad to a lass, and she makes an ado over him as if they'd been to church together not a week sin. I dunna uphold Corneys, but Molly Corney, as is Molly Brunton now, used to speak on this dead man to our Sylvie as if he were her sweetheart in old days. Now there's no smoke without fire, and I'm thinking it's likely enough he were one of them fellows as is always after some lass or another, and as often as not 2 or 3 at a time. Now look at Philip, what a different one he is. He's never thought on a woman but our Sylvie, I'll be bound. I wish he weren't so old-fashioned and faint-hearted. Ay, and t' shop's doing a vast o' business, I've heard say. He's a deal better company too than he used to be. He'd a way of preaching wi' him as couldn't abide. But now he tacks his glass and holds his tongue, leaving room for wiser men to say their say. Such was a conjugal colloquy about this time. Philip was gaining ground with Daniel, and that was something toward winning Sylvia's heart, for she was unaware of her father's change of feeling towards Kinraid, and took all his tenderness towards herself as if they were marks of his regard for her lost lover and his sympathy in her loss, instead of which he was rather feeling as if it might be a good thing after all that the fickle-hearted sailor was dead and drowned. In fact, Daniel was very like a child in all the parts of his character. He was strongly affected by whatever was present, and apt to forget the absent. He acted on impulse, and too often had reason to be sorry for it. But he hated his sorrow too much to let it teach him wisdom for the future. With all his many faults, however, he had something in him which made him be dearly loved, both by the daughter whom he indulged, and the wife who was in fact superior to him, but whom he imagined that he ruled with a wise and absolute sway. Love to Sylvia gave Philip tact. He seemed to find out that to please the women of the threshold he must pay all possible attention to the man, and though he cared little in comparison for Daniel, yet this autumn he was continually thinking of how he could please him. When he had said or done anything to gratify or amuse the father, Sylvia smiled and was kind. Whatever he did was right with his aunt, but even she was unusually glad when her husband was pleased. Still his progress was slow towards his object, and often he sighed himself to sleep with the words, 7 years, and maybe 7 years more. Then in his dreams he saw Kinraid again, sometimes struggling, sometimes sailing towards land, the only one on board a swift advancing ship, alone on deck, stern and avenging, till Philip awoke in remorseful terror. Such and similar dreams returned with a greater frequency when, in the November of that year, the coast between Hartlepool and Monkshaven was overshadowed by the presence of guard ships, driven south from their station at North Shields, by the resolution which the sailors of that port had entered into to resist the press gang, and the energy with which they had begun to carry out their determination. For, on a certain Tuesday evening yet remembered by old inhabitants of North Shields, the sailors in the merchant service met together and overpowered the press gang, dismissing them from the town with the highest contempt, and with their jackets reversed. A numerous mob went with them to Churton Bar, gave them 3 cheers at parting, but vowed to tear them limb from limb should they seek to re-enter North Shields. But a few days afterwards some fresh cause of irritation arose, and 500 sailors, armed with such swords and pistols as they could collect, paraded through the town in the most riotous manner, and at last attempted to seize the tender Eleanor, on some pretext of the ill treatment of the impressed men aboard. This endeavour failed, however, owing to the energetic conduct of the officers in command. Next day this body of sailors set off for Newcastle, but, learning before they reached the town that there was a strong military and civil force prepared to receive them there, they dispersed for the time, but not before the good citizens had received a great fright, the drums of the North Yorkshire militia beating to arms, and the terrified people rushing out into the streets to learn the reason of the alarm, and some of them seeing the militia, under the command of the Earl of Falconberg, marching from the guard-house adjoining Newgate to the house of rendezvous for impressed seamen in the Broad Chase. But a few weeks after, the impressment service took their revenge for the insults they had been subjected to in North Shields. In the dead of night, a cordon was formed round that town by a regiment stationed at Tynemouth barracks. The press gangs belonging to armed vessels lying off Shields Harbour were let loose. No one within the circle could escape, and upwards of 250 men, sailors, mechanics, labourers of every description, were forced on board the armed ships. With that prize they set sail, and wisely left the place, where deep passionate vengeance was sworn against them. Not all the dread of an invasion by the French could reconcile the people of these coasts to the necessity of impressment. Fear and confusion prevailed after this to within many miles of the seashore. A Yorkshire gentleman of rank said that his labourers dispersed like a covey of birds, because a press gang was reported to have established itself so far inland as Tadcaster, and they only returned to work on the assurance from the steward of his master's protection, but even then begged leave to sleep on straw in the stables or outhouses belonging to the landlord, not daring to sleep at their own homes. No fish was caught, for the fishermen dared not venture out to sea. The markets were deserted, as the press gangs might come down on any gathering of men. Prices were raised, and many were impoverished, many others ruined. For in the great struggle in which England was then involved, the navy was esteemed her safeguard, and men must be had at any price of money, or suffering, or of injustice. Landsmen were kidnapped and taken to London, there, in too many instances, to be discharged without redress and penniless, because they were discovered to be useless for the purpose for which they had been taken. Autumn brought back the whaling ships. but the period of their return was full of gloomy anxiety, instead of its being the annual time of rejoicing and feasting, of gladdened households, where brave steady husbands or sons returned, of unlimited and reckless expenditure, and boisterous joviality among those who thought that they had earned unbounded licence on shore by their 6 months of compelled abstinence. In other years this had been the time for new and handsome winter clothing, for cheerful if humble hospitality, for the shopkeepers to display their gayest and best, for the public houses to be crowded, for the streets to be full of blue jackets, rolling along with merry words and open hearts. In other years the boiling houses had been full of active workers, the staithes crowded with barrels, the ship carpenters' yards thronged with seamen and captains. Now a few men, tempted by high wages, went stealthily by back lanes to their work, clustering together, with sinister looks, glancing round corners, and fearful of every approaching footstep, as if they were going on some unlawful business, instead of true honest work. Most of them kept their whaling knives about them ready for bloody defence if they were attacked. The shops were almost deserted. There was no unnecessary expenditure by the men. They dared not venture out to buy lavish presents for the wife or sweetheart or little children. The public houses kept scouts on the lookout, while fierce men drank and swore deep oaths of vengeance in the bar. Men who did not maunder in their cups nor grow foolishly merry, but in whom liquor called forth all the desperate, bad passions of human nature. Indeed, all along the coast of Yorkshire it seemed as if a blight hung over the land and the people. Men dodged about their daily business with hatred and suspicion in their eyes, and many a curse went over the sea to the 3 fatal ships lying motionless at anchor 3 miles off Monkshaven. When first Philip had heard in his shop that these 3 men of war might be seen lying fell and still on the grey horizon, his heart sank, and he scarcely dared to ask their names. For if one should be the Alcestis, if Kinraid should send word to Sylvia, if he should say he was living and loving and faithful, if it should come to pass that the fact of the undelivered message sent by her lover through Philip should reach Sylvia's ears, what would be the position of the latter, not merely in her love, that of course would be hopeless, but in her esteem? All sophistry vanished. The fear of detection awakened Philip to a sense of guilt, and besides he found out that, in spite of all idle talk and careless slander, he could not help believing that Kinraid was in terrible earnest when he uttered those passionate words, and entreated that they might be borne to Sylvia. Some instinct told Philip that if the specksioneer had only flirted with too many, yet that for Sylvia Robson his love was true and vehement. Then Philip tried to convince himself that, from all that was said of his previous character, Kinraid was not capable of an enduring, constant attachment, and with such poor opiate to his conscience as he could obtain from this notion, Philip was obliged to remain content, until, a day or 2 after the first intelligence of the presence of those 3 ships, he learned, with some trouble and pains, that their names were the Megaera, the Bellerophon, and the Hanover. Then he began to perceive how unlikely it was that the Alcestis should have been lingering on this shore all this many months. She was, doubtless, gone far away by this time. She had, probably, joined the fleet on the war station. Who could tell what had become of her and her crew? She might have been in battle before now, and if so... So his previous fancies shrank to nothing, rebuked for their improbability, and with them vanished his self-reproach. Yet there were times when the popular attention seemed totally absorbed by the dread of the press gang, when no other subject was talked about, hardly, in fact, thought about. At such flows of panic, Philip had his own private fears, lest a flash of light should come upon Sylvia, and she should suddenly see that Kinraid's absence might be accounted for in another way besides death. But when he reasoned, this seemed unlikely. No man of war had been seen off the coast, or, if seen, had never been spoken about at the time of Kinraid's disappearance. If he had vanished this winter time, everyone would have been convinced that the press gang had seized upon him. Philip had never heard anyone breathe the dreaded name of the Alcestis. Besides, he went on to think, at the farm they are out of hearing of this one great weary subject of talk. But it was not so, as he became convinced one evening. His aunt caught him a little aside while Sylvia was in the dairy, and her husband talking in the shippen with Kester. "For God's sake, Philip, don't bring us talk about press gang. It's a thing as he got hold on me master till thou'd think him possessed. He's speaking perpetual on it in such a way that thou'd think he was itching to kill him afore he tasted bread again. He really trembles with rage and passion, and at night it's just as bad. He starts up in his sleep, swearing and cursing 'em, till I'm sometimes afraid he'll make an end of me by mistake. And what mun he do last night but open out on Charlie Kinraid, and tell Sylvie he thought m'appen t' gang had got hold on him. Might make her cry salt tears o'er again." Philip spoke, by no wish of his own, but as if compelled to speak. "And who knows but what it's true?" The instant these words had come out of his lips he could have bitten his tongue off, and yet afterwards it was a sort of balm to his conscience that he had so spoken. "What nonsense, Philip!" said his aunt. "Why, there's fearsome ships were far out of sight when he went away. Could go wi' him, and Sylvie just getting over her trouble so nicely. And even my master went on for to say if he'd gotten hold of him, he were not a chap to stay wi' him. He'd ha' given proofs on his hatred to him, time on. He had that made off, and then sure enough we would ha' heard on him somehow. Them Corneys is full on him still, and they but deal to his folk beyond Newcastle, for as my master says, he were just a chap to hang or drown hisself, sooner nor do aught against his will." "What did Sylvie say?" asked Philip in a hoarse, low voice. "Say? Why, all she could do was burst out crying, and after a bit she just repeated her feyther's words, and said anyhow he was dead, for he'd niver live to go to sea wi' a press gang. She knowed him too well for that. Thou see she thinks a deal on him for a spirited chap, as can do what he will. And believe me, she first began to think on him time at fright aboard the Good Fortune, when Darley were killed, and he would seem tame like to her if he couldn't conquer press gangs and men o' war. She'd sooner think on him drowned, as she's ne'er to see him again." "Best so," said Philip, and then to calm his unusually excited aunt, he promised to avoid the subject of the press gang as much as possible. But it was a promise very difficult of performance, for Daniel Robson was, as his wife said, like one possessed. He could hardly think of anything else, though he himself was occasionally weary of the same constantly recurring idea, and would fain have banished it from his mind. He was too old a man to be likely to be taken by them. He had no son to become their victim, but the terror of them, which he had braved and defied in his youth, seemed to come back and take possession of him in his age, and with the terror came impatient hatred. Since his wife's illness the previous winter, he had been a more sober man until now. He was never exactly drunk, for he had a strong, well-seasoned head, but the craving to hear the last news of the actions of the press gang drew him into Monkshaven nearly every day at this dead agricultural season of the year, and a public-house is generally the focus from which gossip radiates, and probably the amount of drink thus consumed weakened Robson's power over his mind, and caused the concentration of thought on one subject. This may be a physiological explanation of what afterwards was spoken of as a supernatural kind of possession, leading him to his doom. End of chapter 22. Read by Kate Mackenzie.
Of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 23. Retaliation. The public house that had been chosen by the leaders of the press gang in Monkshaven at this time for their rendezvous, or randyvows as it was generally pronounced, was an inn of poor repute, with a yard at the back which opened on to the staithe or quay nearest to the open sea. A strong high stone wall bounded this grass-grown mouldy yard on two sides. The house and some unused outbuildings formed the other two. The choice of the place was good enough, both as to situation, which was sufficiently isolated, and yet near to the widening river, and as to the character of the landlord. John Hobbs was a failing man, one who seemed as if doomed to be unfortunate in all his undertakings, and the consequence of all this was that he was envious of the more prosperous, and willing to do anything that might bring him in a little present success in life. His household consisted of his wife, her niece, who had acted as servant, and an out-of-doors man, a brother of Ned Simpson, the well-doing butcher, who at one time had had a fancy for Sylvia. But the one brother was prosperous, the other had gone on sinking in life, like him who was now his master. Neither Hobbs nor his man Simpson were absolutely bad men. If things had gone well with them, they might each have been as scrupulous and conscientious as their neighbours, and even now, supposing the gain in money to be equal, they would sooner have done good than evil. But a very small sum was enough to turn the balance, and in a greater degree than in most cases was the famous maxim of Rochefoucauld true with them, for in the misfortunes of their friends they seemed to see some justification of their own. It was blind fate dealing out events, not that the events themselves were the inevitable consequences of folly or misconduct. To such men as these, the large sum offered by the lieutenant of the press gang for the accommodation of the Mariners' Arms was simply and immediately irresistible. The best room in the dilapidated house was put at the service of the commanding officer of the impress service, and all other arrangements made at his desire, irrespective of all the former unprofitable sources of custom and of business. If the relatives both of Hobbs and of Simpson had not been so well known and so prosperous in the town, they themselves would have received more marks of popular ill opinion than they did during the winter the events of which are now being recorded. As it was, people spoke to them when they appeared at kirk or at market, but held no conversation with them. No, not although they each appeared better dressed than they had either of them done for years past, and although their whole manner showed a change, inasmuch as they had been formerly snarling and misanthropic, and were now civil almost to deprecation. Every one who was capable of understanding the state of feeling in Monkshaven at this time must have been aware that at any moment an explosion might take place, and probably there were those who had judgment enough to be surprised that it did not take place sooner than it did. For until February there were only occasional cries and growls of rage, as the press gang made their captures first here, then there, often, apparently, tranquil for days, then heard of at some distance along the coast, then carrying off a seaman from the very heart of the town. They seemed afraid of provoking any general hostility, such as that which had driven them from Shields, and would have conciliated the inhabitants if they could. The officers on the service and on board the 3 men-of-war coming often into the town, spending largely, talking to all with cheery friendliness, and making themselves very popular in such society as they could obtain access to at the houses of the neighbouring magistrates, or at the rectory. But this, however agreeable, did not forward the object the impress service had in view. And accordingly a more decided step was taken at a time when, although there was no apparent evidence as to the fact, the town was full of the Greenland mariners coming quietly in to renew their yearly engagements, which, when done, would legally entitle them to protection from impressment. One night, it was on a Saturday, February 23rd, when there was a bitter black frost, with a north-east wind sweeping through the streets, and men and women were close shut in their houses, all were startled in their household content and warmth by the sound of the fire-bell busily swinging and pealing out for help. The fire-bell was kept in the market-house, where High Street and Bridge Street met. Every one knew what it meant. Some dwelling, or maybe a boiling house, was on fire, and neighbourly assistance was summoned with all speed, in a town where no water was laid on, nor fire-engines kept in readiness. Men snatched up their hats and rushed out, wives following, some with the readiest wraps they could lay hands on, with which to clothe the over-hasty husbands, others from that mixture of dread and curiosity which draws people to the scene of any disaster. Those of the market people who were making the best of their way homewards, having waited in the town till the early darkness concealed their path, turned back at the sound of the ever-clanging fire-bell, ringing out faster and faster, as if the danger became every instant more pressing. As men ran against or alongside of each other, their breathless question was ever, "Where is it?" and no one could tell. So they pressed onwards into the market-place, sure of obtaining the information desired there, where the fire-bell kept calling out with its furious metal tongue. The dull oil lamps in the adjoining streets only made darkness visible in the thronged market-place, where the buzz of many men's unanswered questions was rising louder and louder. A strange feeling of dread crept over those nearest to the closed market-house. Above them in the air the bell was still clanging, but before them was a door fast shut and locked. No one to speak and tell them why they were summoned, where they ought to be. They were at the heart of the mystery, and it was a silent blank. Their unformed dread took shape at the cry from the outside of the crowd, from where men were still coming down the eastern side of Bridge Street. "The gang! The gang!" shrieked out someone. "The gang are upon us! Help! Help!" Then the fire-bell had been a decoy, a sort of seething the kid in its mother's milk, leading men into a snare through their kindliest feelings. Some dull sense of this added to utter dismay, and made them struggle and strain to get to all the outlets save that in which a fight was now going on, the swish of heavy whips, the thud of bludgeons, the groans, the growls of wounded or infuriated men, coming with terrible distinctness through the darkness to the quickened ear of fear. A breathless group rushed up the blackness of a narrow entry to stand still a while and recover strength for fresh running. For a time nothing but heavy pants and gasps were heard among them. No one knew his neighbour, and their good feeling, so lately abused and preyed upon, made them full of suspicion. The first who spoke was recognized by his voice. "Is it thee, Daniel Robson?" asked his neighbour in a low tone. "Ay, who else should it be?" "I dunno. If I am to be any one else, I'd like to be a chap of nobbut 8 stun. I'm welly done for. It were as bloody a shame as iver I heerd on. Who's to go to t' next fire, I'd like to know?" "I tell yo what, lads," said Daniel, recovering his breath, but speaking in gasps. "We were a pack o' cowards to let 'em carry off yon chaps as easy as they did, I'm reckoning." "I think so indeed," said another voice. Daniel went on. "We was 200, if we was a man, and t' gang has niver numbered above 12. "But they was armed. I seen t' glitter in their cutlasses," spoke out a fresh voice. "What then?" replied he who had latest come, and who stood at the mouth of the entry. "I had my whaling knife wi' me and my pea jacket, as my missus threw at me, and I'd ha' ripped 'em up as soon as winking, if I could ha' thought what was best to do with that damned bell making such a din reet above us. A man can but die onest, and we was ready to go into t' fire for to save folks' lives, and yet we'd none on us to wit to see as we might ha' saved yon poor chaps as screeched out for help." "They'll ha' getten 'em to t' Randyvowse by now," said some one. "They cannot take 'em aboard till morning. T' tide won't serve," said the last speaker but one. Daniel Robson spoke out the thought that was surging up into the brain of every one there. "There's a chance for us a'. How many be we?" By dint of touching each other, the numbers were counted. 7. 7. "But if us 7 turns out and rouses t' town, there'll be many a score ready to gang to Mariners' Arms, and it'll be easy work reskying them chaps as is pressed. Us 7, each man jack on us, go and seek up his friends, and get him as well as he can to the church steps. Then, maybe, there'll be some there as'll not be so soft as we was, letting them poor chaps be carried off from under our noses, just because our ears was busy listening to yon confounded bell, whose clip-clapping tongue I'll tear out afore this week is out." Before Daniel had finished speaking, those nearest to the entrance muttered their assent to his project, and had stolen off, keeping to the darkest side of the streets and lanes, which they threaded in different directions, most of them going straight as sleuth-hounds to the haunts of the wildest and most desperate portion of the seafaring population of Monkshaven. For in the breasts of many, revenge for the misery and alarm of the past winter took a deeper and more ferocious form than Daniel had thought of when he made his proposal of a rescue. To him it was an adventure like many he had been engaged in his younger days. Indeed, the liquor he had drunk had given him a fictitious youth for the time, and it was more in the light of a rough frolic, of which he was to be the leader, that he limped along, always lame from old attacks of rheumatism, chuckling to himself at the apparent stillness of the town, which gave no warning to the press gang at the rendezvous of anything in the wind. Daniel, too, had his friends to summon, old hands like himself, but deep 'uns also like himself, as he imagined. It was 9 o'clock when all who were summoned met at the church steps, and by 9 o'clock Monkshaven in those days was more quiet and asleep than many a town at present is at midnight. The church and churchyard above them were flooded with silver light, for the moon was high in the heavens. The irregular steps were here and there in pure white clearness, here and there in blackest shadow. But more than half-way up to the top, men clustered like bees, all pressing so as to be near enough to question those who stood nearest to the planning of the attack. Here and there a woman, with wild gestures and shrill voice that no entreaty would hush down to the whispered pitch of the men, pushed her way through the crowd, this one imploring immediate action, that adjuring those around her to smite and spare not those who had carried off her man, the father, the breadwinner. Low down in the darkened silent town were many whose hearts went with the angry and excited crowd, and who would bless them and caress them for that night's deeds. Daniel soon found himself a laggard in planning, compared to some of those around him. But when, with the rushing sound of many steps and but few words, they had arrived at the blank, dark, shut-up Mariners' Arms, they paused in surprise at the uninhabited look of the whole house. It was Daniel once more who took the lead. "Speak 'em fair," said he. "Try good words first. Hobbs'll maybe let 'em out quiet, if we can catch a word wi' him. I say, Hobbs," said he, raising his voice, "is I shut up for to neet? For I'd be glad of a glass. I'm Daniel Robson, thou knows." Not one word in reply, any more than from the tomb. But his speech had been heard nevertheless. The crowd behind him began to jeer and to threaten. There was no longer any keeping down their voices, their rage, their terrible oaths. If doors and windows had not of late been strengthened with bars of iron in anticipation of some such occasion, they would have been broken in with the onset of the fierce and now yelling crowd, who rushed against them with the force of a battering ram, to recoil in baffled rage from the vain assault. No sign, no sound from within in that breathless pause. "Come away round here. I've found a way to tobacco behind, where belike it's not so well fenced," said Daniel, who had made way for younger and more powerful men to conduct the assault, and had employed his time meanwhile in examining the back premises. The men rushed after him, almost knocking him down, as he made his way into the lane into which the doors of the outbuildings belonging to the inn opened. Daniel had already broken the fastening of that which opened into a damp, mouldy smelling shippen, in one corner of which a poor lean cow shifted herself on her legs, in an uneasy, restless manner, as her sleeping place was invaded by as many men as could cram themselves into the dark hold. Daniel, at the end farthest from the door, was almost smothered before he could break down the rotten wooden shutter, that, when opened, displayed the weedy yard of the old inn, the full clear light defining the outline of each blade of grass by the delicate black shadow behind. This hole, used to give air and light to what had once been a stable, in the days when horse travellers were in the habit of coming to the Mariners' Arms, was large enough to admit the passage of a man, and Daniel, in virtue of its discovery, was the first to get through. But he was larger and heavier than he had been, his lameness made him less agile, and the impatient crowd behind him gave him a helping push that sent him down on the round stones with which the yard was paved, and for the time disabled him so much that he could only just crawl out of the way of leaping feet and heavy nailed boots, which came through the opening till the yard was filled with men, who now set up a fierce derisive shout, which, to their delight, was answered from within. No more silence, no more dead opposition, a living struggle, a glowing, raging fight, and Daniel thought he should be obliged to sit there still, leaning against the wall, inactive, while the strife and the action were going on in which he had once been foremost. He saw the stones torn up, he saw them used with good effect on the unguarded back door, he cried out in useless warning as he saw the upper windows open, and aim taken among the crowd, but just then the door gave way, and there was an involuntary forward motion in the throng, so that no one was so disabled by the shots as to prevent his forcing his way in with the rest. And now the sounds came veiled by the walls as if some raging, ravening beast growling over his prey. The noise came and went, once utterly ceased, and Daniel raised himself with difficulty to ascertain the cause, when again the roar came clear and fresh, and men poured into the yard again, shouting and rejoicing over the rescued victims of the press gang. Daniel hobbled up and shouted and rejoiced and shook hands with the rest, hardly caring to understand that the lieutenant and his gang had quitted the house by a front window, and that all had poured out in search of them, the greater part, however, returning to liberate the prisoners, and then glut their vengeance on the house and its contents. From all the windows, upper and lower, furniture was now being thrown into the yard. The smash of glass, the heavier crash of wood, the cries, the laughter, the oaths, all excited Daniel to the utmost, and forgetting his bruises, he pressed forwards to lend a helping hand. The wild, rough success of his scheme almost turned his head. He hurraed at every flagrant piece of destruction. He shook hands with every one around him, and at last, when the destroyers inside paused to take breath, he cried out, "If I was as young as once I was, I'd have to rend Devouse down and make a bonfire on it. We'd ring the fire bell then to some purpose." No sooner said than done. Their excitement was ready to take the slightest hint of mischief. Old chairs, broken tables, odd drawers, smashed chests were rapidly and skilfully heaped into a pyramid, and one, who at the first broaching of the idea had gone for live coals the speedier to light up the fire, came now through the crowd with a large shovelful of red-hot cinders. The rioters stopped to take breath and look on like children at the uncertain flickering blaze, which sprang high one moment and dropped down the next, only to creep along the base of the heap of wreck and make secure of its future work. Then the lurid blaze darted up wild, high, and irrepressible, and the men around gave a cry of fierce exultation, and in rough mirth began to try and push each other in. In one of the pauses of the rushing, roaring noise of the flames, the moaning low and groan of the poor alarmed cow fastened up in the shippen caught Daniel's ear, and he understood his groans as well as if they had been words. He limped out of the yard through the now deserted house, where men were busy at the mad work of destruction, and found his way back to the lane into which the shippen opened. The cow was dancing about at the roar and dazzle and heat of the fire, but Daniel knew how to soothe her, and in a few minutes he had the rope around her neck, and led her gently out from the scene of her alarm. He was still in the lane when Simpson, the man of all work at the Mariners' Arms, crept out of some hiding place in the deserted outbuilding, and stood suddenly face to face with Robson. The man was white with fear and rage. "Here, tak' thy beast, and lead her where she'll noane hear yon cries and shouts. She's fairly moithered wi' heat and noise." "They're braining ivery rag I have in the world," gasped out Simpson. "I niver had much, and now I'm a beggar." "Well, thou shouldn't ha' turned again thine own townfolk and harboured t' gang. Sarves thee reet. I'd none be here leading beasts if I were as young as I were. I'd be in t' thick on it. It was thee set 'em on. I heerd thee. I seed thee a helping 'em on to break in. They'd niver ha' thought on attacking t' house and setting fire to yon things if thou hadn't spoken on it." Simpson was now fairly crying, but Daniel did not realize what the loss of all the small property he had in the world was to the poor fellow, rapscallion though he was, broken down, unprosperous ne'er-do-will, in his pride at the good work he believed he had set on foot. "Ay," said he, "it's a great thing for folk to have a chap for to lead 'em wi' a head on his shoulders. I misdoubt me if there were a felly there as would ha' thought o' routling out yon wasp's nest. It takes a deal o' mother wit to be up to things. But t' gang'll never harbour there again one while. I only wish we'd cotched 'em, and I should like to ha' given Hobbs a bit o' my mind." "He's had his sauce," said Simpson dolefully. "Him and me is ruined." "Tut, tut! Thou's got thy brother. He's rich enough. And Hobbs'll do a deal better. He's had his lesson now, and he'll stick to his own side time to come. Here, tak' thy beast, and look after her, for my bones is aching, and make thyself scarce, for some o' them fellies is getting their blood up, and will not be for treating thee o'er well if they fall in with thee. Hobbs ought to be served out. It were him as made t' bargain wi' lieutenant, and he's off safe wi' his wife and his money bag, and I'm left a beggar this neet i' Monkshaven street. My brother and me has had words, and he'll do nought for me but curse me. I had 3 crown pieces, and a good pair o' breeches and a shirt, and I dare say better nor 2 pair o' stockings. I wish t' gang and thee and Hobbs and them mad folks up yonder were a' down in hell, I do." "Come, lad," said Daniel, no ways offended at his companion's wish on his behalf. "I'm none flush mysel', but here's 1/2 crown and 2pence. It's a' I've getten wi' me, but it'll keep thee and t' beast i' food and shelter to neet, and get thee a glass o' comfort too. I had thought o' taking one mysel', but I shannot ha' a penny left, so I'll just toddle home to my missus." Daniel was not in the habit of feeling any emotion at actions not directly affecting himself, or else he might have despised the poor wretch who immediately clutched at the money, and overwhelmed that man with slobbery thanks whom he had not a minute before been cursing. But all Simpson's stronger passions had been long ago used up. Now he only faintly liked and disliked, where once he loved and hated. His only vehement feeling was for himself. That cared for, other men might wither or flourish as best suited them. Many of the doors which had been closed shut when the crowd went down the High Street were partially open as Daniel slowly returned, and light streamed from them on the otherwise dark road. The news of the successful attempt at rescue had reached those who had sate in mourning and desolation an hour or 2 ago, and several of these pressed forwards, as from their watching corner they recognized Daniel's approach. They pressed forward into the street to shake him by the hand, to thank him, for his name had been bruited abroad as one of those who had planned the affair. And at several places he was urged to have a dram, urgency that he was loath for many reasons to refuse. But his increasing uneasiness and pain made him for once abstinent, and only anxious to get home and rest. But he could not help being both touched and flattered at the way in which those who formed his world looked upon him as a hero, and was not insensible to the words of blessing which a wife, whose husband had been impressed and rescued this night, poured down upon him as he passed. "There, there, dunnot crack thy throat wi' blessing. Thy man would ha' done as much for me, though maybe he mightn't ha' showed so much gumption and capability. But them's gifts, and not to be proud on." When Daniel reached the top of the hill on the road home, he turned to look round, but he was lame and bruised. He had gone along slowly, the fire had pretty nearly died out. Only a red hue in the air about the houses at the end of the long High Street, and a hot lurid mist against the hillside beyond where the Mariners' Arms had stood, were still left as signs and tokens of the deed of violence. Daniel looked and chuckled. "That comes o' ringing the fire bell," said he to himself. "It was shame for it to be telling a lie, poor old story-teller." End of chapter 23.
Four of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a LibraVox recording. All LibraryVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibraryVox.org. Recording by Zarnaz. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Brief Rejoicing. Daniel's unusually late absence from home disturbed Belle and Sylvia not a little. He was generally at home between 8 and 9 on market days. They expected to see him the worse for liquor at such times, but this did not shock them. He was no worse than most of his neighbours. Indeed, better than several who went off once or twice a year, or even oftener, on drinking bouts of 2 or 3 days' duration, returning pale, sodden, and somewhat shamefaced, when all their money was gone, and after the conjugal reception was well over, settling down into hard-working and decently sober men, until the temptation again got power over them. But on market days every man drank more than usual. Every bargain or agreement was ratified by drink. They came from greater or less distances, either afoot or on horseback, and the good accommodation for man and beast, as the old inn signs expressed it, always included a considerable amount of liquor to be drunk by the man. Daniel's way of announcing his intention of drinking more than ordinary was always the same. He would say at the last moment, "Missus, I've a mind to get fuddled to-neet," and be off, disregarding her look of remonstrance, and little heeding the injunctions she would call after him to beware of such and such companions, or to attend to his footsteps on his road home. But this night he had given no such warning. Belle and Sylvia put the candle on the low window seat at the usual hour to guide him through the fields. It was a habit kept up even on moonlight nights like this, and sat on each side of the fire, at first scarcely caring to listen, so secure were they of his return. Belle dozed, and Sylvia sat gazing at the fire with abstracted eyes, thinking of the past year, and of the anniversary which was approaching of the day when she had last seen the lover, whom she believed to be dead, lying somewhere fathoms deep beneath the surface of that sunny sea on which she looked day by day, without ever seeing his upturned face through the depths. With whatsoever heart-sick longing for just one more sight she yearned, and inwardly cried. If she could set her eyes on his bright, handsome face, that face which was fading from her memory, overtasked in the too frequent efforts to recall it, if she could see him but once again, coming over the waters beneath which he lay, with supernatural motion, awaiting her at the stile, with the evening sun shining ruddy into his bony eyes, even though after that one instant of vivid and visible life he faded into mist, if she could see him now, sitting in the faintly flickering firelight in the old happy, careless way, on a corner of the dresser, his legs dangling, his busy fingers playing with some of her women's work. She wrung her hands tight together as she implored any power, to let her see him just once again, just once, for 1 minute of passionate delight. Never again would she forget that dear face, if but once more she might set her eyes upon it. Her mother's head fell with a sudden jerk, and she roused herself up, and Sylvia put by her thought of the dead, and her craving after his presence, into that receptacle of her heart where all such are kept closed and sacred from the light of common day. "Feyther's late," said Belle. "It's gone 8, replied Sylvia. "But our clock is better nor an hour forward," answered Belle. "Ay, but the wind brings Monkshaven bells clear to-night. I heard the 8 o'clock bell ringing not 5 minutes ago." It was the fire bell, but she had not distinguished the sound. There was another long silence, both wide awake this time. "He'll have his rheumatics again," said Belle. "It's cold for sartin," said Sylvia. "March weather come afore its time. But I'll make him a treacle posset. It's a famous thing for keeping off hosts." The treacle posset was entertainment enough for both while it was being made, but once placed in a little basin in the oven, there was again time for wonder and anxiety. "He said nought about having a bout, did he, mother?" asked Sylvia at length. "No," said Belle, her face a little contracting. After a while she added, There's many a one as has husbands that goes off drinking without ever saying a word to their wives. My master is none o' that make." "Mother," broke in Sylvia again, "I'll just go and get the lantern out of the shippen, and go up to Brow, and maybe to Ashfield End." "Do, lass," said her mother. "I'll get my wraps and go with thee." "Thou shalt do never such a thing," said Sylvia. "Thou's too frail to go out into night air such a night as this." "Then call Kester up." "Not I. I'm no afraid o' the dark." "But of what thou may meet in the dark, lass." Sylvia shivered all over the sudden thought, suggested by this speech of her mother's, that the idea that had flashed into her own mind of going to look for her father might be an answer to the invocation to the powers which she had made not long ago, that she might indeed meet her dead lover at the Ashfield stile. But though she shivered as this superstitious fancy came into her head, her heart beat firm and regular. Not from darkness, nor from the spirits of the dead was she going to shrink. Her great sorrow had taken away all her girlish nervous fear. She went, and she came back. Neither man nor spirit had she seen. The wind was blowing on the height enough to sweep all creatures before it, but no one was coming. So they sat down again to keep watch. At length his step was heard close to the door, and it startled them even in their state of expectation. "Why, father!" cried Sylvia as he entered, while his wife stood up trembling, but not saying a word. "Am almost done up," said he, sitting heavily down on the chair nearest the door. "Poor old father!" said Sylvia, stooping to take off his heavy clogged shoes, while Bell took the posset out of the oven. "What's this? Posset? What creatures women is for slops!" said he, but he drank it all the same, while Sylvia fastened the door and brought the flaring candle from the window seat. The fresh arrangement of light displayed his face blackened with the smoke, and his clothes disarranged and torn. "Who's been mellin' with thee?" asked Bell. "No one has melled with me, but I've been mellin' with the gang at last." "Thee? They never were for pressing thee," exclaimed both the women at once. "No, they knowed better. They'n getten their belly full as it is. Next time they try it on, I reckon they'll ask if Daniel Robson is within the hearing. I've led a resky this neat, and saved 9 or 10 honest chaps as we pressed, and carried off to Randy Vow's. Me and some others did it, and Hobbs' things and the lieutenant's is a burnt, and by this time I reckon the Randy Vow's is pretty nigh 4 walls ready for a parish pound." "Thou'rt never for saying thou burned it down with the gang in it for sure?" asked Bill. "Na, not this time. The gang fled up the hill like conies, and Hobbs and his folks carried off a bag o' money. But the out tumble-down place is just a heap o' brick and mortar, and the furniture is smouldering in its ashes. And, best of all, the man is free, and will never be caught with a fire bell again." And so he went on to tell of the ruse by which they had been enticed into the market-place, interrupted from time to time by their eager questions, and interrupting himself every now and then with exclamations of weariness and pain, which made him at last say, "Now I'm willing to tell you about it to-morrow, for it's not every day a man can do such great things. But to-night I mun go to bed, even if King George were wanting to know how I managed it all." He wearily went upstairs, and wife and daughter both strove their best to ease his aching limbs, and make him comfortable. The warming pan, only used on state occasions, was taken down and unpapered for his service, and as he got between the warm sheets, he thanked Sylvia and her mother in a sleeping voice, adding, "It's a vast o' comfort to think on yon poor lads as is sleepin' in their own homes this neat." And then slumber fell upon him, and he was hardly roused by Bell softly kissing his weather-beaten cheek, and saying low, "God bless thee, my man. Thou was always for them that was put down and put upon." He murmured some monosyllabic reply, unheard by his wife, who stole away to undress herself noiselessly, and laid herself down on her side of the bed as gently as her stiffened limbs would permit. They were late in rising the next morning. Kester was long since up and at his work among the cattle before he saw the house door open to admit the fresh chilling morning air, and even then Sylvia brushed softly, and went about almost on tiptoe. When the porridge was ready, Kester was called in to his breakfast, which he took sitting at the dresser with the family. A large wooden platter stood in the middle, and each had a bowl of the same material filled with milk. The way was for every one to dip his pewter spoon into the central dish, and convey as much or as little as he liked at a time of the hot porridge into his pure fresh milk. But today Bell told Kester to help himself all at once, and to take his bowl up to the master's room and keep him company. For Daniel was in bed, resting from his weariness, and bemoaning his painful bruises whenever he thought of them. But his mind was still so much occupied with the affair of the previous night, that Bell judged rightly that a new listener would give ease to his body as well as to his mind, and her proposal of Kester's carrying up his breakfast had been received by Daniel with satisfaction. So Kester went up slowly, carrying his overfull basin tenderly, and seated himself on the step leading down into the bedroom, for levels had not been calculated when the old house was built, facing his master, who, half sitting up in the blue check bed, not unwillingly began his relation again, to which Kester listened so attentively that his spoon was often arrested in its progress from the basin to his mouth, opened ready to receive it, while he gazed with unwinking eyes at Daniel narrating his exploits. But after Daniel had fought his battle over again to every auditor within his reach, he found the seclusion of his chamber rather oppressive, without even the usual weekdays' noises below. So after dinner, though far from well, he came down and wandered about the stable and the fields nearest to the house, consulting with Kester as to crops and manure for the most part, but every now and then breaking out into an episodical chuckle over some part of the last night's proceedings. Kester enjoyed the day even more than his master, for he had no bruises to remind him that although a hero, he was also flesh and blood. When they returned to the house, they found Philip there, for it was already dusk. It was Kester's usual Sunday plan to withdraw to bed as early as an hour as he could manage to sleep, often in winter before 6, but now he was too full of interest in what Philip might have to tell of the Monkshaven news to forego his Sabbath privilege of spending the evening sitting on the chair at the end of the dresser behind the door. Philip was as close to Sylvia as he could possibly get without giving her offence when they came in. Her manner was listless and civil. She had lost all that active feeling towards him which made him positively distasteful, and had called out her girlish irritation and impertinence. She now was rather glad to see him than otherwise. He brought some change into the heavy monotony of her life, monotony so peaceful until she had been stirred by passion out of that content with the small daily events which had now become burdensome recurrences. Insensibly to herself, she was becoming dependent on his timid devotion, his constant attention, and he, lover-like, once so attracted, in spite of his judgment, by her liveliness and piquancy, now doted on her languor, and thought her silence more sweet than words. He had only just arrived when master and man came in. He had been to afternoon chapel. None of them had thought of going to the distant church. Worship with them was only an occasional duty, and this day their minds had been too full of the events of the night before. Daniel sat himself heavily down in the accustomed chair, the three-cornered armchair in the fireside corner, which no one thought of anybody else ever occupying on any occasion whatever. In a minute or two he interrupted Philip's words of greeting and inquiry by breaking out into the story of the rescue of last night. But to the mute surprise of Sylvia, the only one who noticed it, Philip's face, instead of expressing admiration and pleasant wonder, lengthened into dismay. Once or twice he began to interrupt, but stopped himself as if he would consider his words again. Kester was never tired of hearing his master talk, but long living together they understood every fold of each other's minds, and his small expressions had much significance to them. Belle, too, sat thankful that her husband should have done such deeds. Only Sylvia was made uneasy by Philip's face and manner. When Daniel had ended, there was a great silence, instead of the questions and compliments he looked to receive. He became testy, and turning to Bell, he said, My nephew looks as though he was a-thinking more on the little profit he has made on his pins and bobs, than as if he were heeding how honest men were saved from being hauled out to yon tender, and carried out of sight of wives and little ones for ever. Wives and little ones may go to workhouse or clem for aught he cares." Philip went very red, and then more sallow than usual. He had not been thinking of Charlie Kinraid, but of quite another thing, while Daniel had told his story. But this was last speech of the old man's brought up the remembrance that was always quick, do what he would do to smother or strangle it. He did not speak for a moment or two, then said, "To-day has not been like Sabbath in Monkshaven. The rioters, as folks call 'em, have been out about all night. They wanted to give battle to the men-o'-war's men, and it were taken up by the better end. And they've sent to my Lord Malton for the militia, and they're coming into town, and they're hunting for a justice for to read the act. Folks do say there'll be never a shop open to-morrow." This was rather a more serious account of the progress of the affair than any one had calculated upon. They looked grave upon it a while, then Daniel took heart and said, "I think we had done almost enough last night, but men's not to be stopped with a straw when their blood is up. Still it's hard lines to call out the soldiers, even if they be but militia. So what we seven hatched in a dark entry has taken a lord to put a stop to it," continued he, chuckling a little, but more faintly this time. Philip went on still graver than before, boldly continuing to say what he knew would be discordant to the family he loved so well. "I should ha' told you all about it. I thought on it just a bit o' news. I'd never thought on such a thing as uncle there having been in it, and I'm main sorry to hear on it, I am." "Why?" said Sylvia breathlessly. "It's never a thing to be sorry on, I'm proud and glad," said Bell. Let it be," said Daniel in much dudgeon. "I were a fool to tell him of such like doings. They're noane in his line. We'll talk on yard measures now." Philip took no notice of this poor attempt at sarcasm. He seemed as if lost in thought. Then he said, "I'm vexed to plague you, but I'd best say all I've got in my mind. There was a vast o' folk at our chapel speaking about it, last night's doings and this morning's work, and how them as set it afoot was assured o' being clapped in the prison and tried for it. And when I heard uncle say as he was one, it like ran through me, for they say as the justices will all be on the government side and mad for vengeance." For an instant there was dead silence. The women looked at each other with blank eyes, as if they were as yet unable to take in the new idea that the conduct which had seemed to them a subject for such pride could be regarded by any one as deserving of punishment or retribution. Daniel spoke before they had recovered from their amazement. "I'm noane sorry for what I did, and I'd do it again to-night if need were. So there's for thee. Thou may tell the justices from me that I reckon I did righter nor them, as lettin' poor fellows be carried off in the very midst of town they're called justices for." Perhaps Philip had better have held his tongue, but he believed in the danger which he was anxious to impress upon his uncle, in order that, knowing what was to be apprehended, the latter might take some pains to avert it. He went on, "But they're making a coil about the Randyvowes being all destroyed." Daniel has taken down his pipe from the shelf in the chimney corner, and was stuffing tobacco in the bowl. He went on pretending to do this a little while after it was filled, for, to tell the truth, he was beginning to feel uncomfortable at the new view of his conduct presented him. Still he was not going to let this appear, so lifting up his head with an indifferent air, he lighted the pipe, blew into it, took it out, and examined it as something were wrong about it. And until that was put to rights, he was unable to attend to anything else. All the while the faithful three who hung upon his well-being, gazing breathless at his proceedings and anxious for his reply. "Randyvowes," said he at length. "It were a good job it were burned down, for such a harbour for vermin I never seed. The rats ran across the yard by hundreds and thousands, and it were no man's property as I have heard tell, but belonged to Chancery, up in Lunnon. So where's the harm done, my fine felly?" Philip was silent. He did not care to brave any further his uncle's angry frown and contracted eye. If he had only known of Daniel Robinson's part in the riot before he had left the town, he would have taken care to have had better authority for the reality of the danger which he had heard spoken about, and in which he could not help believing. As it was, he could only keep quiet until he had ascertained what was the legal peril overhanging the rioters, and how far his uncle had been recognized. Daniel went on puffing angrily. Kester sighed audibly, and then was sorry he had done so, and began to whistle. Bell, full of her new fear, yet desirous to bring all present into some kind of harmony, said, "It'll have been a loss to John Hobbs. All his things burnt, or trampled on. Maybe he deserved it all, but one's a kind o' tender feelings to one's tables and chairs, especial if one's had the bees waxing on them. I wish he had been burned on top of them, I do," growled Daniel, shaking the ash out of his pipe. "Don't speak so ill o' thyself," said his wife. "Thou'd had been the first to pluck him out if he had screeched out. And I'll warrant if they come about with a paper asking for father's name, to make up for what Hobbs has lost by the fire, father'll be forgiving him somewhat," said Sylvia. "Thou knows nought about it," said Daniel. "Hold thy tongue next time till thou's asked to speak, my wench." His sharp, irritated way of speaking was so new to Sylvia that the tears sprang to her eyes, and her lip quivered. Philip saw it all, and yearned over her. He plunged headlong into some other subject to try and divert attention from her. But Daniel was too ill at ease to talk much, and Bell was obliged to try and keep up the semblance of the conversation, with an occasional word or two from Kester, who seemed instinctively to fall into her way of thinking, and to endeavour to keep the dark thought in the background. Sylvia stole off to bed, more concerned at her father's angry way of speaking than the idea of his being amenable to law for what he had done. The one was a sharp present evil, the other something distant and unlikely. Yet a dim terror of this later evil hung over her, and once upstairs she threw herself on her bed and sobbed. Philip heard her where he sat near the bottom of the short steep staircase, and at every sob the cords of love round his heart seemed tightened, and he felt as if he must be there and do something to console her. But instead he sat on talking of nothings, a conversation in which Daniel joined with somewhat of surliness, while Bell, grave and anxious, kept wistfully looking from one to the other, desirous of gleaning some further information on the subject, which had begun to trouble her mind. She hoped some chance would give her the opportunity of privately questioning Philip, but it seemed to be equally her husband's wish to thwart any such intention of hers. He remained in the house place till after Philip had left, although he was evidently so much fatigued as to give some very distinct, though unintentional hints to his visitor to be gone. At length the house door was locked on Philip, and then Daniel prepared to go to bed. Kester had left for his loft above the shippen more than an hour before. Bell had still to rake the fire, and then she would follow her husband upstairs. As she was scraping up the ashes, she heard, intermixed with the noise she was making, the sound of someone rapping gently at the window. In her then frame of mind she started a little, but on looking round she saw Kester's face pressed against the glass, and reassured she softly opened the door. There he stood in the dusk outer air, distinct against the grey darkness beyond, and in his hand something which she presently perceived was a pitchfork. "Missus," whispered he, "I've watched the master to bed, and now I'd be greatly beholden to you if you'd let me just lay down in the house place. I'd warrant never a constable in a Monkshaven should get sight o' the master, and me below to keep ward." Bell shivered a little. "Nay, Kester," she said, patting her hand kindly on his shoulder, "there's nought for to fear. Thy master is not one for the hurt nobody, and I do not think they can harm him for setting yon poor chaps free, as the gang catched in their wicked trap." Kester stood still, then he shook his head slowly. "It's the work as the Randy vows as I'm feared on. Some folks think such a deal of a bonfire." "Then I may lay down afore the fire, missus?" said he beseechingly. "Nay, Kester," she began, But suddenly changing, she said, God bless thee, my man. Come in and lay thee down on the settle, and I'll cover thee up with my cloak as hangs behind the door. We're not many on us that love him, and we'll be all on us under one roof, and never a stone wall or a lock between us. So Kester took up to rest in the house place that night, and no one knew of it besides Bell. End of chapter 24. Recording by Zarnaz.